that goes on there. So I'd like for us to read, but before that, whenever you're studying for something like this, your mind tends to be on it almost all the time. And this morning I was wondering, what was there about Saul? Why was he selected? Why was he picked as king anyhow? Why do they have a king? Exactly. Israel wanted a king. They wanted to be like the nations around them. Did God approve of that? No. It was not what he wanted. But he gave in to them, and he said, Samuel, we're going to give them their king. What do you think they were looking for as a group of people? What were they looking for in their king? What kind of, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, somebody, maybe regal, I don't know if that's the right word or not, but it might be. I'm going to get Samson and Saul mixed up, so bear with me. When Saul is appointed as king a little bit later after this, officially, when he's announced, where was he? He was hiding. He was hiding behind some people. And when he steps out, what is it said about him in the Bible there? How did he measure up with the other people? He was shoulders ahead of everybody else. He was taller. He stuck out. And he must have been a fairly good-looking person because the people liked that, apparently. And here within up to maybe 2 years, Saul hears the words that God has taken you out, basically. And I've got a man who will serve. Sometimes you get your phrases lost too. Will be a man after God's own heart. Now that strikes me in one respect that very badly, of course. What kind of man was Saul? What kind of man was he to be? God selected him. He didn't give the people a choice. He selected that man. Yeah, in the beginning, he was a humble person. But in 2 to 3 short years, he has now been told, your kingdom will not endure. And that doesn't mean his kingdom was going to come to an abrupt end. Saul served a long time. But it would not be left to his ancestry. Now, we know David becomes the next king. What happens to David's reign? He goes on. He goes on to his son on down to Jesus. In Acts, the 13th chapter, first of all, let's go to 1 Samuel 13. In verse 13, he says, Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly, and thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord, which he commanded thee. Now would the Lord have established your kingdom forever. In other words, if you had done what you were told, we're going to get into that a little bit later, your kingdom would have been a kingdom that would have gone on for generations. But he says, but the kingdom shall not continue. Verse 14, the Lord has sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept what the Lord commanded you. Wow. 2 years. And it made me wonder, why would God have chosen that type of person? But that was what the people wanted. He knew what they wanted. They wanted to be like the others. Paul says this in 13. He stood and beckoned. He talking to there. In verse 22, he's talking about verse 21. And afterward they desired a king, and God gave unto them Saul the son of Cis, or Kish for us, a man of the tribe of Benjamin by the space of 40 years. He served as king for 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up unto him them David to be their king, to whom it was said, he also gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, who shall fulfill all my will. And then he continues on in verse 23. It says, Of this man's seed hath God, according to his promises, raised up unto Israel a Savior, Jesus. So Paul is going back and saying this was part of God's plan, to bring Jesus into the world as a son of David. And it also tells me here as that Jesus, being in David's lineage, would be a man like David, a man after God's own heart. And why would that be? He is God. He is deity. And so he would be that type of person. His reign would be that way. But David's was. And what I want to do today is look at both men. What was it about Saul that God rejected him for? What is it about David that he was praised about? They both weren't perfect men. Neither one of them were. But let's talk and study. First Samuel 13 and 14, verse 14. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. Imagine hearing those words. He has, and he's going to tell as we go through this. We've all read the story. We know what it is. He's going to try to defend himself for what he did. Let's read about what happens there at Gilgal. Continuing on. Let's go back first. Let's go to the beginning of it. In verse 5. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. And they came up and pitched in Michmash eastward of Bethaven. And when the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in the caves and thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews came over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead, for Saul was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. He tarried 7 days according to the time that Samuel had appointed him. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered. And Saul said, Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. Interesting. What does Samuel say to him? What have you done? What's the meaning of all this here? You've got these things here. What had Samuel done? At this point here, the big problem, other than disobeying God, I'm sorry. He's not a priest. That's exactly right. King in the Lord's kingdom, priest had responsibilities, the king had responsibilities, and they did not overlap. If you go back and read in the Levitical law, this sacrifice, the first one, the burnt offering sacrifice, was offered by the priest, not the lower people that were Levites. This was by the priest, and the priest had to go through the cleansing process and all of that. Saul didn't do that. Saul didn't do that. But look at him and say, look at what he says here as he gives his defense for it. And Samuel said, "What hast thou done?" And Saul said, "Because I saw that the people were scattered." Okay, that's will be the first one, and we'll talk about it. That the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed. That's number 2. And the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash. Therefore I said, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not supplicated unto the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. Isn't that kind of presumptuous? I forced myself. Let's talk about the things here. Whenever Saul was recognized as, and between this instance here and the one where he was selected by Samuel, first anointing, he was among the people. The people loved him apparently, but here at Gilgal, something happens to him. And having been told by Saul, you go wait in Gilgal for 7 days. I will tell you what must be done, what you should do. I mean, this was a direct command from a prophet of God, so it is a direct command from who? God himself. Samuel disobeyed. That's the first one that he did wrong. He disobeyed God. Number 2, he said the people were scattered from him. They were here expecting something to happen. But what happened? On this 7th day, nothing did. So what were the people going to do? They started getting away from him. And I think Saul's pride took over at this point here, because this was going to be about him, and the sacrifice would be about him, and this would be a glorious thing. But Samuel doesn't show up, at least not at the time that Saul wanted him to. Because what was the command? Wait 7 days, I will be there on the 7th day. So what does Saul, I'm going to get those two mixed up, I told you. So what does Saul do? He offers that sacrifice for himself. He said, you didn't come. He said, the people were scattered. You didn't come within the appointed days. Excuse me. Was that true? No, it wasn't. Excuse me. Exactly. He got there during the 7th day sometime, of course, because of what it said earlier, that immediately after the sacrifice, he shows up. Saul was impatient. It wasn't on his time schedule. He wanted it earlier in the day, apparently. This has to be done on my schedule, not the Lord's. So he offers the sacrifices that he wasn't legally able to do. Had he waited a few more hours, and we don't know what time of the day this was, nor what time Samuel showed up, but it was within the time that he had said. So now Saul has, on top of his pride, has lied, because Samuel did do what he was told. Another reason he said, I didn't want to go down against these people and fight against them because I had not asked God's favor. He'd been told what to do. I don't know that we had the exact command, but he had been told, you go down to do this. And he said, I wanted to have that blessing from God. Well, if God's told you to do something, what are you supposed to do? Yes, sir.
Things about this that Josephus wrote, and we know Josephus wasn't inspired.
Right.
But according to him, before Israel went to battle, Saul's instructions were that to gather the people at Gilgal, and Samuel would come down and offer the sacrifice. I don't think it's so much that Saul offered the sacrifice. There were other people David offered sacrifices also.
Yes.
And he wasn't a Levite. So it was, in my mind, it was strictly, the violation was, you gather here, I'll be there, and we'll pray, and we'll offer sacrifices, and then we'll go to battle. That didn't happen. Saul probably got word that Samuel wasn't going to show up at all. He went ahead with it when he shouldn't have.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what I could read about this particular sacrifice, there were different sacrifices. He said the burnt offering sacrifice, and then he said offer sacrifice offering. There were some that only the priest could do, and I think the burnt offering was one of those. I'm subject to being corrected. I understand if that's not right. But there were other ones that he could do. And like you said, David offered sacrifices. The people were supposed to offer sacrifices. They took part in, even whenever some of those sacrifices were done, they initiated it. They brought the animals. They offered it. They may have even started the cut for the sacrifice. But the priest did most of them. So Samuel got Saul here in a predicament. He really got himself there, really, because he took away the authority that he took authority he didn't have. And to say this down here, that he said, I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Really? He forced himself? What did he want to do? He wanted that sacrifice. He wanted God's approval to go and do what he had already been told. And like Brother White said, this was going to be a deal here. I wish I had read a lot of Josephus. That, is interesting. Right.
This is in the second year, but there's some evidence that that's not a real good translation.
Yeah. I don't think this is written in chronological order necessarily. I don't know. Because I read that too, and I went, wait a minute. Go back to 10, he says, you go wait for me in Gilgal, but wait 3 chapters, and I'll meet you in Gilgal. Because here in 13, he refers back to that this is what the command was, meet at Gilgal. And so, you and I both can only take what's written and try to deduce what happened. But we do know one thing about it was what? Saul was wrong. Saul was wrong. Saul took authority upon himself that he did not have. He forced himself to burn the offerings. And it would have been a very simple thing to have said, the priests that were there, offer these sacrifices so we can go to battle. Pull down God's blessings on us so that this will happen. And what did Samuel tell Saul then? I've done foolishly. Yeah, he had. What happens when we do things foolishly? Hey, and I tell you what, Saul's not the only guy that's done things like that. We all have. We end up sometimes in a pickle, not literally, but we've done something that we shouldn't, and then we have to extricate ourselves from that. Exactly. He failed greatly. And not understanding, of course, not knowing what was in God's mind. God had told him all that he needed to know at that point in time. This has to happen for him. This has to happen for him. But what he says here, he continues on, he says, Samuel said to him, Saul, thou hast done foolishly, thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord. That was the biggest one, like we talked about. Of all the other things he did, that was the first one, which he commanded thee. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom upon Israel forever. In other words, your kingdom your kingship would be one that would have legacy, that your people would, your sons and their sons and their sons would be the ones who would be the kings in the future, not now. But now the kingdom shall not continue, for the Lord has sought him a man after his own heart to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept the commandment which the Lord commanded you. A man after my own heart, as we usually refer to it, a man after God's own heart. What kind of heart? What is that? What is the heart? We know it's not this. I'm sorry? Your mind and your spirit is part of it. Isn't it the real you? What you are deep inside? The person that changes from time to time? Sometimes we get angry, sometimes we're happy, sometimes we're sad. But there's still something in us that is deep. The emotions, the things we hold dearly, our loves, our hates, those are all part of our heart. And what kind of heart had Saul revealed about himself? Wasn't good. I think today we live in a society, and I tell Mona, we're in the me society, and I don't mean me, but we all are in the me society. It's all about me. It's all about me. And when I do something that hurts you, if I do something to Brother Don or whomever, that's because I wanted to do it. And people do it now for such stupid things. So did Saul. So did Saul. All he had to do was wait for Samuel, listen to the command that he was given, and do it. No, I ain't going to do that. Another man would come. A man after God's own heart, and that would be David. But another thing happens after this, and it's interesting to note, even though this was in the first couple of years of his reign, having been reprimanded by Samuel for disobedience, what is he next told to do in chapter 15? I want you to go down and take out Amalek because of what he did when Israel was coming up. And I want you to totally destroy all the people, all their animals. Pretty simple, basic requirement there. Just wipe out your enemy. What did he do? Let's go over there and look at it in chapter 15. Samuel said to Saul in verse 1, "The Lord has sent me to anoint you to be king over the people over Israel. Now therefore hearken unto the word." He talks here about what, I remember what Amalek did. He said down in verse 3, "Now go and smite Amalek and destroy utterly all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." In other words, obliterate them. Obliterate them. They were evil. They stood in Israel's way and stood in God's way. It said in verse 4, "And Saul gathered the people together and numbered them, and Telahim and 200,000 footmen and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek that lay wait in the valley, and he said that these were the Kenites." He tells them, "Y'all get out of the way. We have no beef with you. This is what we're going down." And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of a sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and the fatlings, and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuse they destroyed completely. Go in there and wipe them out. Okay, we can do that, Lord. He doesn't do it. Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandment, and it grieved Samuel, and he cried to the Lord all night. Samuel loved Saul, and this hurt him. He had anointed him at God's request, and now he's being told he's not going to be my king. Not because of Samuel, but because of him. And it said in verse 12, and when Samuel arose early to meet Saul in the morning, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a place, and about none had And Samuel came to Saul and said unto him, Blessed be thou the Lord, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. And Samuel said to him, What means the bleating of the sheep in the ears and the lowing of cattle, which I hear? And Saul said, I have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God, and the rest I have utterly destroyed. And Samuel said to Saul, Stay, and I will tell thee what the Lord said to me this night. And he said, Say on. Samuel said, When you were little in your own sight, wast thou not made the head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed thee king over Israel? The Lord sent thee on a journey and said, Go utterly destroy the sinners and the Amalekites, and fight against them till they are consumed. Wherefore didst thou not obey the voice of the Lord, but didst fly upon the spoil and didst evil in the sight of the Lord? And look what Saul says. Yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have done that which the Lord sent me, and have brought King Agag, the king of the Amalek, and have destroyed the Amalekites. I have done what you told me, except in this little thing. Is that obedience? No, it's not. But then this thing now is announced upon him. So we see the heart of Saul, and as I went through those things, Saul's heart was not good. Probably not from the beginning. But pride, self-will things did take over him. What about David? Now we know that he was a man after God's own heart because he fulfilled these things here and was made king after Saul died. In 1 Kings 15:5, here's what's said about David. Because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and had not turned aside from anything which he commanded him all the days of his life, except the case of Uriah the Hittite. And we know that story about Uriah, his wife Bathsheba. And what David did there was a great sin. It started out innocently, just to walk on top of the house in the cool of the evening. Instead of being at battle with his men, he wasn't. He sees Bathsheba, and what happens? He sees her, he has her brought over, and commits fornication and adultery against his wife, against Uriah. Then he tries to trick Uriah into doing what? Covering it up for him, basically. Go home and have relations with your wife. No. And then what does David resort to? Murder. He tells Jonathan, you take him out where the battle is the hottest. and see that he's killed. And Jonathan does that. David commits murder, lying, covering it up, adultery, fornication. Yet, what is David called? A man after God's own heart. Did Saul do as bad as what David did? Looking at it from an outside perspective. Yeah, he did. But what does God look at? The heart. He wants to see, what are you really made of? He looks at every one of us and says, what are you made of? Because this story may be about Saul and David, but this story is about you and me. It's not just for men, it's for women as well. What kind of heart do you have? How do we know what David's heart was? David wrote a lot of the Psalms, and in Psalm 51, if you want to read along, and this is the title at the top of it, To the Chief Musician, a Psalm of David when Nathan came to him after he had gone to Bathsheba. Because you remember whenever that happened, and Nathan told Saul David this story about the man who came to visit and had all this flocks. And instead of taking one, he took this man's only animal and killed it, the one that they had in their family. And when told that, David got angry. Very angry. And what did Nathan say to David? You're the one I'm talking about. It's you. Thou art the man. You had all these wives. I gave you everything. And that wasn't enough. And if you wanted more, I'd have given it to you. No. But listen to what David says in Psalm 51. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according to the multitude of thy tender mercies. Blot out my transgression. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee only have I sinned and done this evil sight, that thou mightest be justified when thou speakest and be clear when thou judgest. And we're going to skip down to verse 10. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. And down to verse 17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. God's word needs to break our hearts. And I don't mean cry about it, but do an introspective search. Do you pray for a heart like David? I do, but it's not easy to do all the time. But it shows the heart that was in David. What other things did David show in his life? He showed compassion for Saul. Whenever Saul was trying to kill him, he hid in the caves, and he had the opportunity, and his men said, "Here, you can take him, you can kill him now. Nobody won't." He said, "No, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed." Look what he said in Psalm 38. I will declare mine iniquity and will be sorry for my sins. Are we that way? Verses 21 and 22. Forsake me not, O Lord, O my God, be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord, O God, O Lord of my salvation. Here's some thoughts that I had, and there are very few about this again, but it was, for David, it was, and what was against Saul, the same thing. David loved the Lord. He loved the commandments of the Lord. He loved studying the Word. Saul didn't. He had faith in God, deep faith, tremendous faith. And when things were so bad, you can read others of the Psalms that he talks about that. You don't see Saul doing that. And David was compassionate. Whenever his best friend Jonathan, who was the son of Saul, died, and years later, when he became king, what did he ask about Jonathan's family? I'm sorry? Of his family, yeah. Thanks, Tony. He said, is there anybody in Jonathan's family that I may show mercy to? And who was it? Mephibosheth, who was lame. And Saul, what did David do? He brought him and set him at the king's table. He fed him. He took care of him. Would Saul do that? Would Roger do that? Do we pray to be more like Jesus? Sometimes we sing the song, more like you, Jesus, more like you. Do we mean it? Do we want to be more like Jesus? So the question I'm going to leave you with, is your heart like Saul's? I hope it's not. Or is it like David's? Son of Jesse and the son, and also whose son down for centuries later, the Son of God. Thank you. I appreciate your comments, your time. We'll close for today.